Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Eshman. I'm the national editor of The Forward, and we're here to talk about a wonderful book, relatively new, called The Dairy Restaurant by Ben Katchor. It looks at the phenomenon of the Jewish dairy restaurant, and it's very timely because starting Thursday, it's Shavuot, the holiday where we traditionally eat dairy foods. And we're really honored that today joining us is the author of the book, Ben Katchor. Ben is the first cartoonist to win the MacArthur Prize, the Genius Grant. He's also received a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he's a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Among his previous works is the masterful Julius Knippel Real Estate Photographer, which appeared intermittently in the foreword itself. So this is how it's going to work. Ben is going to give an overview, a quick overview of his book, so you get a chance to see the wonderful drawings in the book, which I can't explain as well as he could show you. And then we're going to talk, Ben and I, and we'll be taking your questions. So if you have questions, make sure to put them in the box marked Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, Ben, nice to meet you.
Thank you. Yeah, good to meet you. So should I try? I'm going to try to share my screen now, right?
Yeah, do that.
And let me know if you can see the slideshow. You
Looks good to me.
Okay. Well, for those of you who don't know what a Jewish dairy restaurant is, this is a short explanation. It sounds like trying to explain a very obvious thing to a Martian or somebody, but anyway, some of you may remember or know the B&H Dairy Luncheonette on 2nd Avenue. That's still in business. It's gone through a lot of different owners. And then one of the last of the really large-scale places was a Ratner's on Delancey Street. That, I think, lasted into the 90s. And these restaurants, in America at least, there's another history in this book that's pre-America. And there's also a phenomenon of dairy restaurants of some sort existing in almost every culture in the world. So at least every culture that used dairy products in their food. But the ones that the book ends up centering on, and the ones I discovered growing up in New York, were these Eastern European oriented restaurants. And these restaurants offered a menu that was on an amalgam of regional cuisines that developed in Poland, in Russia, in Romania, all over the Austro-Hungarian Empire over hundreds of years. And these were dishes that some may have been invented by Jews, others may have been adapted to comply with Jewish dietary law. And one aspect of that law forbid the mixing of milk and meat, and thus to simplify things, you'd have restaurants dealing with these dairy oriented foods, vegetables, grains, and including fish and all milk products, and then another kind of restaurant, delicatessen, or the Jewish meat restaurant, that was the other side of that division, that dietary division. And the foods were, in a dairy restaurant, the famous dishes were blintzes, cold beet borscht with sour cream and usually a boiled potato, knishes of all types, kasha, potato knishes, and other kinds, and a dish called gefilte fish, or stuffed fish, which ended up as a more like a ball of ground fish. The thing is that for people who were no longer concerned with these dietary laws, this cuisine had an appeal of its own. And so, I'm not an observing dietary laws, but I sort of love the food that derived from these laws or came about because of these laws. And in the process of uncovering the history of these restaurants, I came to understand their place in a larger history of institutions devised to feed travelers that goes back to antiquity, because a lot of this has to do with eating away from home. At home, it's easy to control what you're eating. That's if you can afford food. And the other angle to this is that the dairy restaurant could only come into existence when those ancient dietary laws encountered the invention of the restaurant, which is a mid-18th century French invention. That I go into that in the book. And the restaurant, instead of offering a single dish of the day, tried to feed people according to their individual biological needs and tastes. And so diners could order what they felt like eating from a large menu of carefully prepared dishes or restaurants. And beyond the matters of culinary taste, choosing a restaurant or cafe in the early 20th century became a social and political act. Restaurants and cafes on the Lower East Side of Manhattan catered to socialists, to anarchists, to Orthodox Jews, and to specific national cuisines. That's seen in a Romanian wine cellar with the famous Cymbalon player, Joseph Moskowitz. For some, meat eating was associated with the appetitive and aggressive behavior of the upper classes. And dairy restaurants also catered to a brand of vegetarianism associated with Leo Tolstoy and his Christian anarchist belief. My history goes back to explore the pastoral impulse, that desire in the face of spreading industrialization and urban life to return to an unspoiled natural environment with its attendant healthful foods and curative atmosphere. From the Garden of Eden and Arcadia to the public pleasure gardens of 18th century England, to the growth of health resorts throughout Europe. That's Sholem Aleichem at Marienbad, a health spa with curative water, but also a place where people took a milk cure. And this same hunger for unspoiled lands incidentally led to the European conquest of much of the world. The small, desperate restaurateurs who ran these many dairy restaurants chronicled in my book were engaged in the hopeless task of offering the working and middle classes an opportunity to partake of the pastoral impulse within the four walls of a store and the commercial restraints of a brutal market economy. For a contemporary vegan or anyone aware of the ruinous effects of industrialized animal-based food production, the history of the dairy restaurant may seem to involve quaint and meaningless distinctions. The purpose of compiling this history is to remind us that the city was once composed of countless small businesses offering a wide range of idiosyncratically designed environments in which to eat while imbibing the political ideologies of your fellow diner, and that the serious business of feeding people was not driven solely by the desire to maximize profit. And in this book, I try to unravel that complicated history. So I'm going
And you do it so well. I think that there's really a connective tissue between Julius Knipple and this sense of this small business community, this love of this kind of fading New York, this fading small business community, these people who ground out a living, basically serving people in the same class as themselves, the middle class or the lower middle classes. And in some ways, I felt like this book is kind of an elegy for that, is like a lot of your work, it seems.
Well, yeah, I mean, in retrospect, it's not that I've just missed this food, because this food can be had in a, in a Polish luncheonette. You can make it at home. There are all kinds of upscale dairy restaurants now. What I think I miss is the idea of a Jewish working class or lower middle class and the kinds of businesses catering to those kinds of people. And the whole aesthetic of these places. They didn't have money to get too wrapped up in decor. And they actually chose not to use an ethnic decor. That Romanian wine cellar, that's kind of an exception in Jewish restaurant dining in New York. Most of them adopted this very clean idea of tiles or formica or stainless steel, the modern luncheonette.
Right.
That kind of decor, not an ethnic decor. And for Jews, an ethnic decor is usually was a matter of adopting the kind of ethnic decor of the country they would live in. Romanian wine cellars that I don't think was specifically Jewish.
But there's something, right. I mean, there's something very comfortable about these places. Jonas Schimmel's, I don't know if the people listening have been there, but it's one of the dairy restaurants on the Lower East Side, one of the few left, right? And
Jonas
there's something
Schimmel
very comforting about them.
Yeah, Jonas Schimmel was more of a knish bakery when it started, that started to adopt a few other things like sour milk. I don't think it was ever, it's a complicated story, Jonas Schimmel, because the name, I think very early on, started being used by people other than Jonas Schimmel. And I think he opened another restaurant somewhere else. It's described in the book that may have been more of a full menu dairy restaurant.
Right.
But there were all those liminal cases of bakeries that put in a few tables, and then you could call them a restaurant or an eating place.
Right.
So
I love in the book you compare this. You universalize it to some extent. I mean, we think of the dairy restaurant as something very particular to Jews. And yet when you really pull back a little bit, as you point out, many cultures have this, and it goes back to the 18th century even, or to the beginnings of the restaurant, this kind of pastoral impulse.
Yeah, there's, in German-speaking countries, there's the Milchhall and the Meierei. In France, there was this thing called a cremerie, which was also kind of a dairy store that became a restaurant. And
then there's the dairy in Central Park, which I always wondered what that building was. And you're saying it was actually a dairy restaurant at one point.
It was more of a milk drinking place. Before the invention of refrigeration, there was a kind of there were businesses that specialized in providing fresh milk, either by bringing the cow to the customer or by having cows on the premises. So that's part of this story. A lot of the dairy food in these Eastern European oriented restaurants in New York was milk that had been turned to cheese or clabbered in some way, because so apparently a lot of Jews have a lactose intolerance.
Hmm.
But they were not, I don't remember seeing people drinking glasses of fresh milk at most dairy restaurants. They were having sour cream or farmer's cheese or in various cooked forms. But anyway, but you know, the idea of suffering from eating was part of a lot of eating in the early 20th century. You know, when
But also the idea of using this food as a way to be healthy. One thing that struck me is how everything old is new again. Like there was this entire discussion, this revelation about yogurt, which I think they called sour milk,
yeah,
which is basically yogurt. And they kind of discovered that this had microbes that were good for your body. I mean, just everything that's going on now about the human biome, they kind of went through that in the 19th or late 19th century. And that led to the development of yogurt, you know, and commercialization of yogurt, which you document too.
yeah, that's part of this pastoral impulse, the idea that you could, that these early foods or very unadulterated foods, you know, anything short of mother's milk
Right.
would help you reset your biological system. And so these milk cures, you would go to a place like Marienbad and just live on milk for a few weeks.
You have the menu for that, and it doesn't look very healthy, just this constant guzzling of milk at
Yeah,
breakfast.
well, I don't know. It was a kind of strenuous diet
Yeah.
to see what would happen if you limited yourself to that. There were also grape juice cures and all kinds of water cures. So it was one of many. And, you know, it had to do with milk. It should be milk from cows that grazed on a particular part of the foothills of the Alps. And it was the beginning of this whole development of health resorts and resorts in general, you know, tourism, going places to cure yourself. So,
And I was surprised that you list all the people, famous people, who not only took these cures, but then went on to become aficionados of the dairy restaurant, like Emma Goldman, who I think you say actually owned owned an ice cream store.
She owned an ice cream parlor. I don't think she didn't own a dairy restaurant. But there's a whole idea that for an intellectual running a dairy, even a store that just sold dairy products, was kind of an easy job. Maybe you'd have your wife or husband do it while you were upstairs reading. So there's a whole history of intellectuals getting involved in the dairy business. Not specifically, but these were kind of places that would have a few tables and chairs, and you could have your milk or your kefir there, and you know, have a roll with it. And so yeah, it's a strange idea. I don't know what that kind of job today would be, where you think it would be, maybe other than investing in the stock market, where you actually don't have to do much and make a living.
And yet
Anyway,
people left this business because, as you say, it's a very hard job with very low margins. So the families encourage their kids to get out of it.
yeah, that's a theme that runs through the book. So most of these restaurants ended after the generation that started the place retired. They didn't want their children to go into this business. And this impulse of all immigrant groups, it's not specific to Jews, but of all immigrant groups to kind of move up socially or take part in the leisure class, either through a profession or something that was perceived to be less physically arduous, or maybe would pay more. I don't know. It's an impulse that hasn't led to very good results, I think, culturally. And
Right.
I think people are rethinking that impulse, because you know, a Jewish fellow who went into the cafe eating business, the guy who started Starbucks, it's the biggest, it is the most, the biggest retail operation, I think, in the world. So there's no question of him being short of money, but it's also, the most deadly, boring place in the world to go for a cup of coffee.
It has none of the taste of a dairy, yeah, even though it's essentially a dairy restaurant when you think about it.
Yeah, they don't have, right. It's a sort of dairy cafe.
Funny. Ben, you talk about in the book the milchadic personality. In other words,
yeah, that's something I sort of coined, that idea, but it's a person who has this kind of ruminative personality, and maybe someone who wants to live more in ideas than in the real world. And their expressions in Yiddish. I actually came across it in a book recently. Bleiben auf der Milchbank, the person who remains on the dairy bench or table. They don't want to be part of this world. They're not entering the real world where, things are flashing. And there's even an expression, Michael Wex reminded me that expression, machen flashig, means let's get down to reality, to real business.
And then you reminded me in the book that the most famous example of that is Tevye, who's actually a milkman.
Yeah, he sort of fell into that by accident. So he's not, these are people who are so not of this world that they wouldn't even think of going into a particular business like that. So there's another famous character Sholem Aleichem wrote about, Yossel Kotek, who actually ran a dairy restaurant or cafe in Warsaw. So it's, the people around these restaurants were not necessarily milichdik personalities, because they had to be in business and they had to have that kind of ambition. So probably more their customers would fall into that category.
The most famous was probably I.B. Singer. You talk about him frequenting one dairy restaurant. Which was the one that?
Well, the fame, when he lived in Manhattan, the famous, but he also ate a lot at the Garden Dairy on East Broadway, next to up the block from the Forwards building. But when he lived in Manhattan, he was a regular at the famous dairy on 72nd Street.
And you speak in the book about how a lot of these dairy restaurants in their prime were divided by ideology. These were places like the coffee houses where people would go and argue.
Well, yeah, less dairy restaurant. Very early on, there may have been more cafes than restaurants. I noticed a lot of these restaurants would advertise across this political spectrum. They'd advertise in the Forwards and in the Freiheit. So I mean, there's some evidence that Rappaport's, that was a very famous dairy restaurant down the block from Ratner's on 2nd Avenue. They catered some IWO, that was the International Workers' Order, a sort of communist organization. But I think at some point, this issue of the politics of eating out, people had to compromise. They just wanted to eat. And you couldn't be ideologically sure, who you were giving your money to. So
I see that we are getting so many questions. There are so many, and I almost feel like I'm taking up too much of your time because there's so many, but well, here's one of them. Somebody's correcting me and saying sour milk is not yogurt. My parents used to let unhomogenized milk go sour, much to the distaste of us kids.
Yeah, they're all specific bacteria you use. So yogurt is one. So if you just take a container of certain kinds of a whole milk, it will clabber.
And
So,
somebody else is saying, what about the consumption of goat and sheep's milk, which is near and dear to my heart because I love goat's milk. And in your book, actually, you really talk about the original dairy animals for the Hebrews were goats.
yeah, probably smaller animals. If you didn't have a lot of land for cows, you could have a goat. Last night I was watching that film, that Yiddish film, East and West, I think it's called. And someone actually has a goat in their kitchen in like a
Yeah.
little pen, and they milk it and have a glass of milk. So yeah, goats were a little easier to handle.
Well, one of the things your book does, which I find so interesting, is you literally start at the beginning with the creation of Earth, because if you really want to understand the development of these dairy restaurants, you go back to the Bible and the separation of meat and milk, which is don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, and the kid is of course a goat. So, but that also makes for a very different kind of, the Jewish dairy restaurant is such a different phenomenon than other kinds of vegetarian restaurants, say, because you can have fish.
Yeah, they're not, there was some overlap. Some of the famous Jewish-owned vegetarian restaurants like Schildkraut's, he had branches all over the city at one point. He would have a few Eastern European dishes on the menu, but mainly not, mainly world in vegetarian concoctions. So
Someone asked which of these restaurants were the most successful. Some of these were very successful for a while, weren't they?
yeah, I mean, the most successful, I guess, were the ones that continued more than one generation, like Ratner's, the Harmatz, Jacob Harmatz. His children took over and continued, up until, forget when it closed. And I know it was around into the 90s. So if that's your measure of success, I don't know. Steinberg's on the Upper West Side was very popular. There was a famous in Brooklyn on Eastern Parkway that was very popular in New York. So success, I don't know. It's hard to say based on which did the most business. Or the Ratners were the one on Delancey Street was very large. So was Rappaport's. The others tended to be smaller.
Ben, did these places appeal to outsiders, to non-Jews as much as they did to Jews, in the way that the bagel caught on so much among non-Jews?
I think toward the end, the Garden Dairy on East Broadway, most of it was no longer heavily a Jewish neighborhood, and there'd be people from the neighborhood, Black people, Puerto Rican people eating there. So, most of these places offered a lot of the American luncheonette menu, tuna fish sandwiches, salads, things like that, and a scrambled egg. You could eat other things. You didn't have to have gefilte fish, which might be alien to some people. Mm-hmm. So they catered to more than a Jewish audience, but for the most part, once the Jewish clientele left, they would either close or move. They'd follow the audience.
One thing you mentioned that was surprising to me is that the owners of these places were neither necessarily vegetarians nor observant Jews.
No, they were restaurateurs. Some of them, the favorite place. I always tried to find out what their favorite restaurants were, and it was usually an Irish or a steakhouse. It wasn't a Jewish restaurant at all. And
right. Somebody asked if you mention in the book what the influence of Kellogg's and Battle Creek and the whole Graham, and you go quite a bit into the detail of how this dovetailed with the health food movement. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Well, there was an early vegetarian movement in Europe and England, and Jews were not particularly part of it. But by the 20th century, there was specifically Yiddish vegetarian movement. They had a newspaper. There were several restaurants that were part of that movement. And, it tied into Leo Tolstoy at some point in his life, became a vegetarian. And he was very influential among kind of socialists and radical Jews. So that helped. It was seen as a kind of solidarity with the poor, or people who couldn't afford meat, to eat vegetarian. So it was not only just a health issue, it was kind of a class issue on some levels. But I go into it. It's a complicated history.
So much of it. And you also go into the history of the development of the dairy restaurant in concert with the Yiddish theater, which was something else I didn't know before this.
Well, it's more of the Jewish restaurant business that tended to happen. I mean, in Romania, in these sort of outdoor eating places, and then in London, it was a lot of there was a lot of connections between small restaurateurs who were supporters of the theater. It's not specifically about dairy restaurants. The book goes into the Jewish restaurant business in general, only as a way of explaining what a dairy would be like. You'd have to know what a non-dairy Jewish restaurant was like. So I go into that, the early history of Jews running restaurants of any kind.
Mm-hmm. Which is related, you also go even farther back into the idea of Jewish hospitality that goes back to Abraham in the Bible. I mean, you really like to begin at the beginning. Yeah,
there's this whole idea of when you lived in the desert, that kind of desert, when somebody crossed, the path of your tent in the desert, you would feed them. And the idea of hospitality was just a given.
Mm-hmm.
They could live with you for a few days, things like that. So, sort of interesting question.
There's a lot of questions about specific places. I think there's so much nostalgia attached to these places. Someone asked about Madame Stahl's in Coney Island in Brooklyn.
Oh, Mrs. Stahl's, yeah. I go into that. Again, that was a bakery with tables so you could eat there. I mean, they didn't serve a full dairy menu of fish and things like that.
Okay, there's a couple more questions along those lines. Was the place on the second floor where the Bowery meets Canal a dairy restaurant? How good's your memory?
I'm trying to remember what that is. I don't know.
Maybe Julie Melby could be more specific. And what about Dubow's on Kings Highway?
Yeah, Dubow's, as far as I could see, and I only knew the one up in the garment district. There was a Dubow's, which wasn't a dairy. I don't think they were. I think they served both dairy and meat. So there's a whole moment in Jewish history of the Jewish style restaurant, which served blintzes and brisket on the same menu. So,
and it feels like
if anybody who's sending in questions, if they have information about, I notice some of them have relatives who are in the dairy business, you should email me.
Why don't you talk about your website?
I put up a website called dairyrestauranthistory.com. And there's a link to my email address. And yeah, I'd love to talk to you if you have any memories of those places.
The idea I had this image of you sitting at like B&H, suddenly coming up with the idea to do this. Am I just fantasizing, or is that where the idea came?
No, I was back in the 80s or maybe even earlier. I was interested in other aspects of Jewish culture in New York, and I started interviewing people, musicians and people, but a lot of it ended up being oriented toward food. But the idea of a book didn't come about until Next Book came into existence, and the editor at the time asked me about that. I think he knew I was interested in this subject. So it seemed like it would be a little book. But that was, 20 years later. It was much more of a research project. And that's just because there isn't a history that I could critique. There was no history of this specific kind of restaurant. So
yeah, you were telling me that there's so little written. I mean, there's troves of information about pastrami and meat restaurants, but very little on the dairy.
The fact that these were never became, until, very late in their history, they became kind of shrines of the Lower East Side. But before that, they're not the place you would, necessarily think about talking about. And even, for outsiders, for the English language press, they wouldn't be as exotic as talking about a meat restaurant, with goose fat dripping down the walls and things like that.
Right. I mean, that's the thing that gets the most attention. Mark Van Arks asked if there are dairy restaurants in Los Angeles, and you have a great section of your book where you go through every single dairy restaurant around the country, the world.
Now, it can be very confusing. There was a phenomenon in America in the late 19th and early 20th century called a dairy lunch. And some of them were actually called dairy restaurants. And they were the American version of a place that was sort of built around a milk, offering fresh milk. And there were hundreds of these places. I mean, Childs was kind of related to them. There was a famous chain in New York. So if you look at the history, you'll see lots of dairy lunch places all over America. They were not Jewish, Eastern European oriented dairy restaurants. They would have fresh milk and ham sandwiches. And it's a slightly different history, but these coexisted. I have a place called Tanner's back in the 30s on Brooklyn Avenue in Los Angeles.
I think you list a couple places that were in Boyle Heights in the, really early on.
Barnholtz's Farm and Dairy Restaurant, South Fairfax, Wilshire Dairy Restaurant, Two Worlds Kosher Health Food. And then, up by the 70s, Steven Spielberg's mother opened a place called the Milky Way, which is the kind of modern version of a dairy restaurant. Not too many Eastern European dishes on it, like a kosher pizzeria that exists all over.
Yeah, I mean, those to me feel very different than the kind of places you're talking about.
Well, the cuisine is facing more toward the Middle East and Italy than toward
Eastern Europe.
In Europe.
Because
but
these are really
technically dairy restaurants. What? Sorry.
Well, these are really tied in some ways to the history of Jewish immigration in America. You talk about how, I had no idea how many Romanian restaurants there were and how many Hungarian, and each group had its own kind of restaurant and its own place where they would hang out. And that's more what these are related to.
Yeah. Somebody asks about the milk bars in Poland. That's the Mleczania, and there's a whole chapter on that in the book. And in a Jewish neighborhood, these were owned by Jews, and there were some small places, like the one owned by this character that Shalom Aleichem wrote about, Yossel Kotek. But there were dozens of them in Warsaw. Some were owned by Jews and some by non-Jews. And after the war, the idea of this idea of a dairy-oriented place came back in Poland. But
owned by Jews.
Yeah, some of them were. Oh, after the war, no, there weren't too many Jews opening restaurants. But in the interwar period, there were quite a few of these places that were run by Jews. But the thing is, the history doesn't follow a logical path. And some of the people who opened dairy restaurants in New York never knew of them in Europe, if they came from Europe. They just didn't exist in their towns. And then other places like Chernovitz, apparently there were many there. And one famous one that's well documented called Friedman's. So someone could arrive in New York and try to open a place that would feature a dairy menu, and have other models, maybe American models in mind. So it's complicated where people's ideas came from.
So what happened to the, I mean, how would you describe the demise of the dairy restaurant? What happened to it?
Well, yeah, there are various reasons, a lot of them closed. Well, I would say one of the major reasons is that children didn't want these places to continue. So I mean, that's a major reason. Another reason is as Jews were exposed to world cuisine, even observant Jews, they realized they could eat sushi and they could open other kinds of restaurants. So I think world cuisine started to compete with, this limited Eastern European menu. There are other reasons. Toward the, after the 50s, a lot of them felt obliged to take on kosher certification. And in some cases, that raised the price of the food. So they were in competition with a local coffee shop that could undersell them. I mean, that's a minor point, but it was part
of it. Did the ones who survived generally tend to own the, I mean, I imagine some of this has to do with New York real estate, that the ones who survived own their places.
The Harmatz family that owned the Ratners on Delancey very early on got involved in the real estate business, and the restaurant was really a sideline to their real estate business.
So which ones are really, I know I've been to Yonah Schimmel's every time I go to New York, I try to go there if I ever get to New York again, and B&H, but are there any others that are still around in the?
Yeah, they tend to be in Hasidic or Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods like Williamsburg or Borough Park. There are a few. There's the Green and Ackerman in Williamsburg, which at least, I haven't been there lately, but the last time I went there, they actually made a gefilte fish that was where the ground fish was stuffed back into the body of a fish.
Wow, old school.
Fish. I don't know whether, I tried to ask them whether they still made it like that, but it wasn't clear. And there are a few on 13th Avenue in Brooklyn and the next avenue over. But the kosher pizzeria for a lot of people serves the purpose of a dairy restaurant.
But like you said, it's just, it's just not the same kind of a feel. It's not the same food.
Yeah, it's different food, different. I go into, what the difference in atmosphere. It's the difference between Eastern European Jewish culture and Israeli culture in some cases.
Right.
So that's one of the differences.
There's a feeling, I mean, I guess I get the sense from your book that there's something lost when we lose these places. Is that how you feel?
Well, the main thing that was lost, as I said, is the aesthetic of a working class. And there's no problem going to working class Dominican restaurants and Chinese restaurants in New York, because there are thousands of those. You just go up to, a Dominican neighborhood or a Chinatown. I think it's that the outside of a Hasidic neighborhood or an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, where there still is a working class eating culture, they sort of, because of this reason we talked about, their children wanting to move into professions that
Right.
kind of restaurant just stopped existing. So we have Starbucks as a Jewish worldwide phenomenon.
But we had this other phenomenon, it seems, where you have a whole new generation discovering Jewish food and reviving it in a more of an elevated way, like Russ and Daughters. Many people asked about Russ and
Yeah,
Daughters. And
yeah,
they will
that,
have some dairy items on their menu that are kind of the distillation of the best of the dairy
yeah.
restaurant.
I mean, the appetizing store, they could also, if you put a few chairs in an appetizing store, you could call it a restaurant. And I know they have their own, they have a cafe now. And
Many, I think they have several, right?
yeah, and so, you know, I wouldn't say it's catering to a working class Jewish population. I don't, and you know that in Midtown Manhattan or downtown Manhattan, that's something that is not a there isn't that kind of clientele. So
Mhm.
so the aesthetic, but the aesthetic I think can transcend the existence of the class that brought about these places. You know, there
But
wasn't
then
a big concern with decor, and you know, they were priced so that people could afford them.
right. Except that what I find happens, like at Jonas Schimmel's, is the decor has become the pictures of the famous people who eat there and the reviews they get, and the decor
Well,
becomes a self-referential, almost like
yeah,
a museum.
yeah, they become a shrine to a vanished culture rather than
Right.
a living culture. And you know, it's the same. It's part of, you know, the disappearance of Yiddish being used as a Jewish language in New York. Other than among, you know, there's a big young movement of Yiddishists and people trying to use that language again, which is really
And the
exciting.
forward and the forward has a Yiddish website. Mark asked, Mark Van Arks, about is there a connection to milk restaurants and film TV literature? The Korova Milk Bar in Clockwork Orange. He says he wonders if that's because Kubrick grew up around these restaurants in the Bronx.
Yeah, the other angle to that, the ones in there was a phenomenon of the milk bar, which was a place like a counter place where you'd go in and walk in and order a glass of fresh milk. There was a big phenomenon in London and in Australia, and there were a few in New York, but the specific, that term milk bar, it sounds like he may be, it may have been, you know, it's written by Anthony Burgess, so he may have been referring to the London milk bar phenomenon.
Which
There were
was
quite a
separate,
few of them.
which were not necessarily Jewish.
No, there was just a place again that served fresh milk and milk-based drinks. So I think if you go back to Burgess, Anthony Burgess, is that his name? Burgess.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guy who wrote Clockwork Orange, the novel.
So this is evoking your book. Your book is evoking so much nostalgia for people. Somebody wrote, Fred Glazer wants to know about the Odessa Cafe on Avenue A. Did you look into
Yeah, that
that?
was a Polish. They called them, some were called Ukrainian, but I think most of the people who worked there were Polish. But yeah, they would have a lot of these foods, a lot of these dishes, blintzes, and you know, kasha vanishkas were cross-cultural. You know, Jews made them were careful to make them according to dietary
It was
laws.
interesting, right? It was
I
interesting to
mean,
me in your book. You kind of which dishes caught on and which didn't. You know, blintzes definitely caught on,
yeah,
but Mama Liga, which was an original dairy restaurant dish, never really penetrated.
it's yeah, corn. Well, polenta. There are other kinds of cornmeal dishes, but no, that was a very specifically seemed to be Romanian. You
Romanian.
had to have a Romanian clientele, otherwise they gave it up. When I was in the B&H in April, or actually maybe even early March, and I always used to have gefilte fish there. And I asked the counterman whether they had it. because I didn't see it on the wall menu. And he said, we haven't had gefilte fish here for 25 years. And that's kind of a standard thing to have in a dairy restaurant. And they always had it, and it was pretty good. So these, the minute the audience for the dish disappears, the dish
They die. They literally died off.
Yeah.
Patty Weber wrote that her dad's family started Ratner's.
A Hormet's family? Yeah. Email me and you can tell me more about.
Yeah, Patty, you should definitely.
Yeah, Ben@Katchor.com. And
be in touch.
yeah, and the Raleigh. I went to the Raleigh once. Anyway, as I said, all of these dishes can be remade. You can open up new, within the real estate market of New York. If you have the money, you can open a new dairy restaurant. The thing that's harder to recreate is this working class aesthetic. And that's an aesthetic, based on poverty or lack of funds to do things.
You mentioned in the book that some of these owners actually opened up their restaurants specifically to feed poor people. Like they would create a restaurant that would.
Yeah, you're talking about, there were these things called like the penny restaurants and the nickel. There were one or two Jewish restaurants of that type that were kind of philanthropic operations. Now, most people in the restaurant business wanted to make a living, but it could have been a subsistence living. I don't think they went, they always had food to eat. They might have lived nearby or upstairs. And so it wasn't a kind of large scale. The profit margin was much smaller. And it still is for, immigrant working class restaurants.
Somebody wrote that Lloyd Trufelman, Lieberman's Luncheonette, 4801 16th Avenue, still in business, classic dairy restaurant. I didn't see that. Was that in your book, Lieberman's?
Is that it? Where is that? 16th Avenue?
4801 16th Avenue in Brooklyn.
Oh, yeah, I think I list that. I think so. It's not, yeah, I'm pretty sure I mentioned that. Yeah, it's sort of a breakfast and lunch place. I don't think it's open. It's not an evening place.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's there. It's still there on near, I don't know.
And somebody else mentioned, which I think your book goes into this a little bit, the connection between the dairy restaurant and the Catskills, that whole universe of the Jewish working class.
Yeah. Part of that connection is these, the architecture of some of these, the earlier hotels, they had this kind of Tyrolean architecture that goes back to an influence of the Swiss Alps and that whole world of going for milk cures. But yeah, they would have a dairy. They would tend to serve them together, but with separate dishes. They had, I think, plastic covers for the milcha dishes and metal ones for the meat dishes. So but they would bring them out. People were eating them together. I don't think too many of those places were. I mean, that was considered observing dietary law. And there's no reason you can't eat milk and meat at the same table. You just can't share it. So if you draw a line across the table and eat milk on one side, that's fine.
Right.
The separation of these milk and meat in restaurants was at some point became a culinary issue. They wanted to say we specialize in dairy dishes, and and it would be very complicated to serve both. But there are some examples in the book of places that either served both in the same room or had separate rooms. So there's a lot of angles to that.
It feels like
observant you are.
when we talked about the demise of it, the other issue is that the dairy restaurant got squeezed between this kind of return to this heavy carnivore steakhouse, this celebration of the carnivore life, and then the vegan life on the other hand. And the dairy restaurants were neither vegan or even vegetarian or carnivore. They were just something in between.
They're a Jewish idea of what you can eat with milk. Fish, a lot of fish in these restaurants, all kinds of fish and aspic, cold fish, broiled fish. They had a big fish menu.
So do you think, we have to wrap up, but well, before I wrap up, I wanted to thank Mira Fox at the Forward who holds all these chats, all these Zooms together so well. And I want to thank you, Ben, for joining us and all the people who participated. Do you think that there's going to be any kind of, with all this new renewed interest in Jewish food, do you think there will be kind of a revival of the dairy restaurant in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I think some of the new Jewish restaurants do have dairy menus. The one in the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown is all dairy.
Oh, I think that's a Russ and Daughters.
No, that's up at the Jewish Museum. That's the one down in Battery.
Oh, the one downtown, that's a dairy?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's no problem with doing that. I mean, the issue is, will they have this atmosphere? And that's a harder thing to replicate because it has to do with this larger cultural world that's gone.
That's vanished.
And that could come back if the economy completely collapses and everybody joins the working class again. So that might happen.
So I promised people, because it's Shavuot, I made some blintzes. I wish I could share them with you, Ben, but I did put the recipe. I think Mira put the recipe in the chat. It's actually, I was going to use the Ratner recipe, but I made the Ratner recipe and my blintzes are better. So I put my blintz recipe.
What kind of cheese do you use?
I use ricotta and I use a little bit of cream cheese or sour cream. And it just, I just think, you know, the Ratner's, the traditional dairy counter blintz is a little grainy for me.
They use farmer's cheese?
They use farmer's cheese, which is a little harder to get too than ricotta, but I just like the flavor of the, I'm not as nostalgic.
No, these dishes, people assume that a blintz is a blintz. I mean, the simpler a food becomes, the more variation there is in its preparation. So no two blintzes are the same. Some people make them sweeter, some people, I mean, there's absolutely every blintz, even made by the same person, there's variation. But I would say
mine are exceptional.
Really?
Oh,
yeah,
so
somebody, now here's an interesting story. A woman I know who grew up in Hungary thinks when they eat, I think they still call them blintzes, but they're really rolled blini, like a crepe. Roll thing. And the idea to her of frying it is just abhorrent. The idea of taking a perfectly good crepe and frying it seems crazy.
Yeah, I think there's another recipe for placenta or something, I think it's called, and I think that's not fried. I want to try those one time.
No, I find them to be very insubstantial if you don't fry them. I don't think sweet crepe can compare with a fried blintz. Any French idea of a crepe or a galette, if it's not, I think frying it really adds a whole nother layer of texture.
Yeah.
Blintz.
It's also a whole nother layer of unhealthfulness and heart disease.
That's the price you pay, but
that's a small price.
Yeah, the texture is not, for me, there's no comparison. So yeah, these things are all matters of taste and what you grew up with, and you know. So,
well, I want to thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all the participants. Mira at the Forward again. Please look at the recipe, look on the Forward for all of our Shavuot coverage. And I hope one day we can meet in person at a dairy restaurant.
Yeah.
D&H.
Thank you.
Okay. Nice talking to you. Bye.